and I'll start this.
All right, so we're going to continue our discussion that we started last night about different ways
enough?
for managing thresholds.
Okay.
And first of all, we're going to talk about, or I'm going to give examples for how you might want to manually set your thresholds for monopolar training. Okay, and just to kind of orient us to this therapist screen, yeah, this is a monopolar protocol because it's C4 minus A2. So we've got one sensor on the scalp and we're referencing to the same side of the ear that we're training. Our ground is on the other ear. And then we see the raw signal like we were looking at last week is nice and low and smooth and stable. So it's looking pretty good. And then when we look down in the filtered bands, we're inhibiting 4 to 7, rewarding 12 to 15, inhibiting 22 to 36. So I want to go and I want to look over at the average amplitudes to see which frequency band seems to be the issue in this person's EEG. And like I said before, their EEG looks overall pretty good. You know, if you can have 10 microvolts of the 4 to 7 hertz activity on the map when somebody's not doing anything, and then when they're doing neurofeedback training, that's actually a task. So we would like their slow wave activity to be below 10 if they're an adult, and maybe below the mid-teens if they're a child, right? We want it to be a little bit lower. Well, we're good there because this person's 4 to 7 hertz activity is coming in at 9.5 microvolts. And then when we look at the 12 to 15, you only need about 5 or 6 microvolts of 12 to 15 hertz activity, and they've got 6.3. So that's pretty good. That's right where we like it to be. And then the 22 to 36, it's just a little bit higher than we might want it to be. So if I was training this person, that would be the focus of my training. And if I was going to not use the training wheels F11 approach for managing thresholds, then I know that 22 to 36 is going to be the target of my training, then what I do is I set the other thresholds first, because as we were talking last week, in order for a beat to even be available and eager, you've got to be making enough of what you're rewarding to go outside the reward threshold. So I think of that threshold as a floor that I don't want that amplitude to fall below. So if you want to have at least 5 microvolts of 12 to 15 hertz activity, you can see on this slide that the threshold has been set at 5 microvolts. And so the average at the time this picture was taken was coming in at 6.3. So that means it was outside the reward threshold 80% of the time. So 80% of the time there is a beep available as long as the inhibit activity is within the threshold. And since 4 to 7 isn't really our primary concern here, I'm going to treat that threshold like a ceiling. I don't want that activity to go much above. And if I don't really want it to go much above 10, if I set that threshold at 9.5, that's like a ceiling. I don't want that activity to go above. And then that frees me up to tighten up the threshold on the fast frequency beta, which is going to be the primary focus of our training here. And you can see that the limbo bar is set a little bit, if I was training this person, I might actually lower that threshold a little bit because the average amplitude is coming in at 7.4 microvolts, and we actually want that to go down. It makes sense to set your limbo bar threshold on that band at least a little bit lower than where it's coming in, where it's already coming in. However, here's where the percentages can come in handy. If we know that inhibiting the fast frequency beta at 25% is a moderate challenge level for that activity. That's what we talked about last week. Well, what we've already done is tighten up that threshold. So now, when the person walks up to that limbo bar, instead of 25% of their body being above the threshold, we have narrowed that threshold and lowered that limbo bar so that 41% of their body is above it. So that's a tougher challenge level. That's a tougher challenge level. And as long as the person can tolerate that level of frustration, that's good. Okay, so you can kind of see how, by the way, if you're going to manually adjust a threshold, what you do is you use your page down key to highlight the band you're interested in adjusting. And then if you're going to if you want to narrow a threshold, you use your minus key. If you want to widen the threshold, you use your plus key. And it's got to be highlighted in order to manipulate the band. And then hitting the enter key will get rid of the highlighting. So you can individually target each band. We might have talked about this last week, but research shows that it's actually good to have a challenging, a tougher challenge level is better than an easy challenge level, simply because the tougher challenge keeps the person's brain engaged. It wants to figure it out. And we want to we want to find that sweet spot for where it's challenging enough to keep the brain's interest without being, incredibly frustrating. And that's where you'll use your clinical judgment and what you know about the person, and even just watching the person as they train and checking in with them to see how it's going. Right? Okay, we're going to look at another example. Okay, so here's the person that has way too much slow wave activity in their EEG. I can tell that just by looking at the raw signal and seeing how much space there is in between the peaks of the waves. I mean, it's pretty easy to count the peaks of the waves. And again, if we look at the raw EEG average amplitude, which is at 54.7, even for a child, that's too much. That's too high. That's too high of an average amplitude. And again, this is an inefficient EEG because of excess slow wave. That's going to show up again when we look at the filter band. So again, we're inhibiting 4 to 7. In this example, we're rewarding 15 to 18 and inhibiting 22 to 36. Well, when I go and I look at the average amplitudes, it is true that all the average amplitudes are higher than we might want them to be. But by far, the slow wave is the farthest off from what we would want it to be. Because yes, our betas, our 15 to 18 and our 22 to 36, if we only need about 5 or 6 microvolts of both of those frequencies, and we've got basically double that. But if this was an adult, and we look up at the 4 to 7, then their slow wave amplitude is about 3 times as much as we would want to have. And even for a child, it would be like double the amount of slow wave that we would want to see, right? So that is going to be the target of my training. So again, I always like to just start with the reward threshold myself, because that's what the beep is really hinges on. So I'm going to treat that threshold like a floor, that I don't want that activity to fall below. I know you only need about 5 or 6 microvolts. So I just put that threshold at 5 microvolts. And you can see the higher percentage on the reward threshold means that it's easier, right? So look, if 65% threshold on your reward band is a moderate challenge level, we have lowered the hurdle so that more of this person's body is above it. So if you lower a hurdle, that makes the obstacle easier. So a higher percentage on your reward band means that threshold has been set at an easier level. The opposite is true for your inhibits. If there's a higher percentage on your inhibit band, that means that threshold has been set at a tougher challenge level. So lowering a limbo bar increases the challenge level of that game. Lowering a hurdle makes that obstacle easier to negotiate, right? Okay, so I'm pretty much making it easy for them to get a beep. A beep is going to be readily available as long as their slow wave is within range. I still have the other inhibit band to worry about, and I'm gonna, again, this person has more than enough 22 to 36, but Hertz activity. But chances are, as they bring their slow wave down, the other amplitudes will drop as well. Since right now the 22 to 36 is not necessarily the primary focus of my training, I'm going to set that threshold at a pretty easy level, and I'm going to give them more wiggle room than I would if this frequency was the focus of my training, right? So we said, a 25% inhibit is a moderate challenge level on the 22 to 36. I'm loosening it up a little bit because I want to put all the emphasis of my training on getting that slow wave down. So again, the percentages can help you know where to set the threshold in microvolts. But you can also just look at the microvolts and the average amplitude. So if their average amplitude is coming in at 9, and I'm going to give them a little bit of wiggle room, and I'm going to treat this like a ceiling, I really don't want that fast frequency beta to get up into the double digits, because then that would probably mean the person was tensing up and trying really hard. So that's why I set that threshold at around 11 microvolts. And then since I've made these first two thresholds pretty easy, now I can really concentrate on making that slow wave threshold tough. So if the average amplitude was coming in at 31.9 microvolts, then I want to set the threshold in microvolts at least a little bit lower than the average amplitude is already coming in. So I have it at 25.5. If I look over at the percentage, and I know that a 35% inhibit is kind of a moderate challenge on slow wave, I have narrowed that threshold and lowered that limbo bar so that now instead of that activity being outside the threshold 35% of the time, it's outside the threshold 61% of the time. So that's just a tougher challenge level. And I'm going to keep repeating this just because I hope that with repetition it's going to make sense. I apologize to those of you who, pick this up really quickly. It's just, in my experience, this often takes a little while for people to kind of wrap their minds around, because this has to do with spatial relationships. And a lot of us that aren't that fond of numbers often have some trouble with spatial relationships. At least I know that it's true for me. So I'm just talking it through so that hopefully with enough repetition it makes sense to most
But this
people.
is really different than what...
Okay, so...
this is really different from what we were taught.
I know, I thought when she was talking about this in this way, that it makes sense to put your attention to what might be the biggest problem instead of doing it all. Yeah.
They gave us those fixed.
Well, and so she said that the inhibit bands, the percentages, she said that we should change those in the auto goals to 35, 65, and 25, because she said what's defaulted there was actually set for people that have ADD, and that to make it more realistic, it should start here in with these percentages.
Even though Angelica says it's 20 to 30, 55 to 60, and 10 to 15.
Yeah.
This makes sense.
Yeah. But when Mary explains it, it's like, okay, I get it. Yeah.
I'm going to have to watch this again.
Well, I'm recording it, so this
So
one
here,
you'll be able to watch again.
what we really want to see happen is this person bringing their slow wave activity down. And we're going to talk about coaching tonight as well. And really, the only way that you can bring your slow wave activity down, the average amplitude of your slow wave activity down, while you're sitting in an office training, is to shift your focus outward, right? I mean, you could also do it by vigorously exercising, but it's hard to do that when you're attached to the sensors because they fall off, and also it creates a lot of movement artifacts. So when you're sitting in a chair training, really the only way you can get that average amplitude of the slow wave down is to shift your focus outward. And I believe we were talking about this last week a little bit. You know, a lot of people that don't really know anything other than an inner focus, they might have a hard time even knowing what you're talking about. So for people like that, I often try to use a game like long term, or long term is just a line graph of the brain waves like you see on the review screen, but you're watching it unfold in real time across the screen. And the violet line corresponds with the slow wave activity in the long-term game. So if that was the target of your training, you could call your person's attention to that line and say, see if you can make that violet line go down. And if it's going up, I want to know where your mind is, or what you're thinking about, or what your mind is telling you. Okay, so and then hopefully sometimes we have to help catch them at first. So if their purple line is going up, the violet line is going up, or if you're letting them watch this therapist screen. And when I have people train with the therapist screen, I just highlight the frequency band that I'm really interested in them working on. I'll point out the average amplitude, and I'll say, see if you can make that number go down. If it comes down any at all, that's great. If it goes up, I want to know what you're thinking about, right? And if you see that going up and you notice you're caught up in a thought or a daydream or getting sleepy or something like that, I want you to see if you can shift your focus outward. Okay, so what's the next one? So here, and I know that we looked at this last week as well, but this is someone that has too much fast frequency activity in their EEG. And again, the average amplitudes will make that pretty obvious. But if this was, again, an adult, if we'd like that 2 to 6 hertz activity to be below 10, well, they've got too much of that. If we want the 12 to 15 hertz activity to be around 5 or 6 microvolts, they got too much of that. And then we go down to the 22 to 36, that should also be 5 or 6. And lo and behold, it's the very highest amplitude. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's probably not too much of a secret by now. There is no protocol that we do that where we want the fast frequency beta to have the highest amplitude. There's no neurofeedback protocol that I know of where we want the fast frequency beta to be the highest amplitude. We're always trying to help people relax, calm down, not work so hard. So people like this, they have to learn to let go a little bit.
This is me.
And to trust their brain to do it. And to hopefully their nervous system is going to figure out they can get good results by expending a lot less energy than they have been doing. So again, if I know that 22 to 36 is going to be the target of my training, I'm going to save that threshold for the last. And then I'm going to start with my reward band, because you got to be making it over that reward threshold for a beat to be available. Again, I'm treating that activity like a floor. I don't want that to fall below, that amplitude to fall below. And they've already got 20 microvolts and they only need 5 or 6. So I set my floor down at 6 microvolts because it's got a lot of room to come down, right? Well, then I'm going to go to the other inhibit that's not really my main focus right now. And I'm going to treat that, again, I'm setting this threshold higher than I would want it to be normally, but that's just because right now it's not the focus of my training. So I'm going to give this person a little bit of wiggle room on their slow wave threshold. And if it's coming in average of 21.6 microvolts, I've set the ceiling of that threshold. Again, I've given them a little bit of wiggle room, but I don't want it to go above 24 microvolts. And again, I use that percentage column to help me at least have a moderate challenge level there without it being the primary focus of my training, right? So then that means we're going to put the main emphasis of our training on the fast frequency beta. So we've got 22.3 microvolts average amplitude. I'm going to set that limbo bar at 20 microvolts. So at least they got to make less than what they've been making to get a beep. And again, just as a reminder, so you know the person will be getting a beep anytime there's a green line in the reward filtered band and no red line in either one of your inhibit bands. So it won't be too long before you can tell why your client is or is not earning a beep, right? And then if you see that they aren't earning a beep because they've got way too much fast frequency beta, then what we got to try to coach them to do is let go, not try so hard, trust their brain, let go of anything anxiety provoking that their mind is telling them. I always tell my people, your mind can observe, but I do not want your mind supervising or criticizing, because again, that's wasted effort, that's wasted energy, because your mind can't really figure out how to do this anyway. Your brain figures it out by altering the rate and combination of its brain cells firing patterns. And again, as long as your client really wants to do this, then, and is not actively against doing it, then, and they know that they're trying to get beeps, they're trying to get that you're getting warmer message, then their brain is going to automatically try everything it knows how to do to earn that beep for them. They can trust that. It's just, it's easier said than done for our over-aroused people to trust, to go with the flow, right? They're used to controlling things and micromanaging and trying really hard and all that stuff. And the bad news is that gets really reinforced at school and at work. So they've often had a lifetime of being reinforced for working harder than they need to. It's just not that good for your quality of life or your quality of sleep when you work harder than you need to all the time. So at least while they're in this neurofeedback yoga class, we want them to experiment with doing things using less energy, okay? So the things that make that fast frequency beta go up in amplitude would be trying really hard, tensing up, feeling frustrated. The things that make the slow wave amplitude go up are getting sleepy, daydreamy, losing focus, visualizing something in your head other than what's happening right now. Those are what makes the slow wave go up. Okay. So,
I'm slow wave.
Another word about monopolar training, it's often easier for people to get a subjective.
Say that again.
I'm the slow wave, and you're the fast wave.
I am. And today when I was, so I couldn't figure out how to do C3 minus C4 without looking everything up. So I just did CZ minus A2. And when I was working, like I could see right away, all of my waves are too high, but especially my beta. And I, in between, like in rest periods, I would stretch and try to get my shoulders and my neck to just kind of chill out. And finally, toward the end, I started getting sleepy. I was yawning, and I thought, "Wow, what's going on? You know, like my beta waves. What's going? You know, what's happening?" But when I would focus on the game, I just would keep looking and saying the next dot, just the next dot, and then I would say, "You did it. You can. You are." And I would start smiling, and then it would not stop. Like, I stop a lot as I'm training. It stops a lot. Sometimes it's like, oh my God, is it ever going to go again? Maybe it's broken. Yeah.
Turns black, just sits there.
Yeah, it just sits there. It gets into that black ball, and I'm like,
Yeah,
stop.
I get more of that in my PZ.
Mm,
I work hard there.
yeah. Okay.
Sense about what they're doing when they're doing monopolar training, because it's a more direct measurement, and things that they do, and you'll often have, you probably already have had clients do this. They like to test out the mirror. So they'll tense up and they'll see, does the yellow line or the red line go up, or does the yellow box get big on highway or island? Or if they start purposely doing something to get to see if the slow wave will go up. You know, they like to test out the mirror, and it will give them a more direct response when you're using a monopolar protocol. So the mirror tends to make more sense when you're doing monopolar training. But we're going to talk about setting thresholds for bipolar protocols. It's a little bit of a different animal, because we're not looking at the amplitudes of either site with a bipolar protocol. We're looking at the difference between the amplitudes of the two sites that we're training. And just like Goldilocks, just like our Goldilocks principle, we don't want these two sites to be doing exactly the same thing. So we would not want there to be too little difference between the activity at these two sites, but we also don't want there to be too much difference between the activity at these two sites, right? We want just the right amount. So I have this cleaning crew picture because I often think of shared activity, because that's kind of what we're looking at, how much shared activity is going on between these sites. I think about if you hired a cleaning crew, let's say you had 4 people in your cleaning crew. You do not want all 4 people tripping over themselves doing the same task at the same time. That's not an efficient use of your manpower. You also do not want one of the 4 people in your house and the other 3 people in your neighbor's house. Not an efficient use of your manpower. So here, this is a C3 minus C4, and right now we're going to be talking about interhemispheric bipolar placements, where you have one sensor on the left side of the head and one sensor on the right side of the head. When you're using one of those interhemispheric protocols, I'm going to tell you what those average amplitudes should be to have a reasonable amount of shared activity, or a reasonable amount of difference between those two sites. Okay, so we'd like our 2 to 6 hertz activity to be somewhere between 6 to 9 microvolts. So like I was saying before, at a C3 minus C4 hookup, we're not looking at the average amplitudes at C3. We're not looking at the average amplitudes at C4. We're looking at the difference between the amplitudes at C3 versus C4. So if we get a really big number in the filter bands, that means there's too much difference between what's happening left and right. If we get a really small number, that would mean there's not enough difference, or there's too much similarity between these two sites. So let's talk about what the number should be for a reasonable amount of difference. So the 2 to 6 hertz activity should have a difference of anywhere from 6 to 9 microvolts. The example on this slide, there's a difference of 27.5 microvolts at the time this picture was taken. That's way too much. So if we want that average amplitude to be somewhere between 6 to 9, theirs is way higher than that. Okay, so chances are that's going to be the target of my training, but let's check it out. So the 12 to 15 hertz activity could have, betas are easy because they're always 5 or 6, whether you're talking about a monopolar placement or a bipolar interhemispheric placement, it's still the same. You only need 5 or 6 microvolts there. So the 12 to 15 isn't that far off what it should be. The 22 to 36 also isn't that far off from what it should be. It should be 5 or 6, it's 5.8. So the thing that is way off what we would expect for it to be is this slow wave activity, or the difference in what's happening in the slow wave activity left versus right. So that's going to be the target of my training. So again, I'm going to use the same strategy of treating the reward threshold like a floor that I don't, in microvolts, that I don't want that activity to fall below. Then the inhibit band that we're not as concerned about, we'll treat that like a ceiling. We don't want that activity to go much above. And then that frees us up to put most of the emphasis of our training on the slow wave inhibit. So again, I've put the limbo bar in microvolts at least a little bit lower than the average amplitude is currently coming in. And that percentage can help me know how hard or easy I've set that limbo bar. So again, if a 35% inhibit on slow wave activity is moderate, we've narrowed the threshold and lowered the limbo bar so that more of that activity is outside the threshold. So they're going to have to bring the difference in that activity down more than they have been to get a beat. Right? And that's the thing with C3 minus C4, when you have a bipolar protocol, those two sites have to check in with one another and coordinate their activity differently than they have been doing to get the beep and to get the game to go. Okay. So here, I'm always kind of scanning my average amplitudes to see which one's out of whack. The 2 to 6 is good because that difference can be anywhere from 6 to 9 microvolts. This person has a difference of 8.3. The 12 to 15 is good because you need a difference of 5 or 6. They've got 5, so that's good. So then when we look at the 22 to 36, that's our problem. Because again, with the 22 to 36, you only need a difference of 5 or 6. This person has a difference of 9.7 microvolts. So that's going to be where I set my toughest threshold, and the other ones I'm going to make easier. And then the whole point of this training is to let go, trust, allow it to happen. I try to avoid the R word because oftentimes for people that have too much fast frequency beta, the minute you ask them to relax, their fast frequency beta shoots up, right? So let go is usually the word that works best for me. And interestingly enough, even though this is a bipolar protocol, you can still use the same kinds of coaching strategies that you do with monopolar placements. So even though this is a bipolar hookup, if my goal is to get the person to bring their fast frequency beta activity down, then I'm still going to say, let go, allow it to unfold, take the pressure off, let go of anything unhelpful your mind might be telling you, that kind of thing. And still with the bipolar protocol, if the slow wave is the issue, you can still tell them to shift their focus outward. Now, what what may make this mirror not be so direct is because when you're looking at the difference in the amplitudes and the brain is working on changing something about the difference in the amplitudes, it has a choice about what strategy it uses. And I believe we've talked about this before, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. So if they're trying to decrease the difference in our inhibit bands, it can do that by changing something about the amplitude at one site versus the other, or it can adjust something about the timing of brain cells firing at those speeds at those two sites, right? It can adjust something about the timing on the left versus the right in these frequency ranges. And just looking at the numbers on our screen, we can't really tell which strategy the person's brain is using. But as long as the numbers are kind of trending in the direction we want them to go, we can guess that their brain is picking the strategy it likes, and it's getting the message about what we're asking it to do. And by the way, with the monopolar protocols, it's pretty clear that with our inhibits, we're saying make less of this, and with our reward, we're saying make enough of this. Well, when you have a bipolar protocol with two sensors on the scalp, technically your inhibit thresholds are saying decrease the difference in these amplitudes, left versus right, while increasing the difference in the reward activity, left versus right. And that's kind of cool because we've got a mixture of tasks there, and that really prevents someone from, let's say, someone who had way too much similarity between these two sites. That would, hedging our bets like this, where they have to increase the difference in certain frequency ranges while decreasing the difference in others, helps prevent someone from going from way too similar activity to way too dissimilar activity. And you can trust their brain to sort it out the way that it wants to. Okay? Here's an example. This will come up very often when you're doing bipolar training, where all your numbers are really low. This is another left-right interhemispheric hookup, C5 minus C6. This one is really considered a great protocol for people who have true bipolar disorder. And I think we talked about this before, but just as a review, an easy way to find C5 and C6. You just go 4 fingers above the ear in line with the preauricular point. On the left side, that would be C5. On the right side, it would be C6. Well, since this is a left-right interhemispheric hookup, then we want the difference in the 2 to 6 to be anywhere from 6 to 9 microvolts. They only have a difference of 4.4. We want the difference in the 13 to 16 to be 5 or 6. They've only got a difference of 1.7 in that band. And then, of course, again, the 22 to 36, we'd like that difference to be 5 or 6, and it's 2.5. So technically, everything has room to come up because the left and the right sides need to differentiate their activity a little bit more. Okay, so this would be an example of our cleaning crew. They're all tripping over each other to do the same thing at the same time. And why, that's bad. I mean, if it helps you to think of this, again, I think I used this analogy with you guys before, but remember when I was going to that college football game, and it's a small college town, and everybody in town is going to the same place at the same time? That caused a tremendous traffic jam because everybody's trying to do the same thing at the exact same time. And in fact, that's what happens when people have seizures. Everything starts firing in the theta range. Everything's doing the same time, and it gums up the works, right? Well, on the way back from the football game, where it was a blowout, so everybody started leaving early, and everybody's leaving at slightly different times, and they're going in different directions when they leave the football stadium. That's enough of a difference for the traffic to flow much more freely, right? I Okay, so just wanted to point that out. This can also illustrate something else we talked about with the F11 key. When you use the F11 key to adjust your thresholds, the lowest the F11 will ever set either of your inhibit bands in microvolts is 6. But that's fine, because there's no real reason to inhibit either monopolar protocols or bipolar protocols lower than 6 microvolts. I'm talking about inhibit bands there, because you need a certain amount of that activity, and you can even have more than that, right? So that's the reason why when you hit your F11 key, you'll notice it, and it stands out really strongly when you're doing bipolar training like this, like C3 minus C4 or C5 minus C6. And when you get really small numbers, like I've seen it, and you will too, where all the average amplitudes are 3s and 2s. If you hit your F11 F11 key, the lowest it will adjust any of your inhibit thresholds is 6 microvolts. Okay. Well, here, since everything has room to differentiate, and by the way, when these two sites on an interhemispheric protocol, when the two sites, when all the numbers are way lower than you want them to be, that means one side of their brain is having more influence than it should over what they're both doing. And they need to differentiate a little bit more. Like we talked about how we want the left and the right side to both be activated, but we want the left side to be slightly more activated than the right? We need to have a little bit more difference there. So in this case, the target of my training is going to be increasing the difference in the reward band. Okay, so I'm going to treat both my inhibit thresholds, since those average amplitudes are both lower than they could be, and they have room to come up. It is okay if the inhibit amplitudes start out way lower than they could be, and they have room to come up. It's okay if they do come up, as long as the activity in your reward band is also coming up. With bipolar protocols, you would not want one of your inhibit band activities shooting up independently of the other two. That wouldn't be too good, right? But here, the primary focus of our training is going to be increasing the difference in the reward band. And then as long as that's coming up, it's okay if the other two come up as well. And that would mean that these two sites are differentiating their activity. So our inhibit thresholds are going to be like a ceiling that we don't want the activity to go above. And then we have to really set our hurdle, our reward threshold. So since they have so little difference in that frequency range, we can't set the hurdle too high. Because if the average amplitude is 1.7, and we set that hurdle at 2.5 microvolts, that means that they're only above threshold 16% of the time. A 65% threshold on your reward band is a moderate challenge level. So we have raised the height of that high jump, so that instead of that activity being outside the threshold 65% of the time, it's only outside the threshold 16% of the time. So that's a pretty tough challenge level. But this is why with someone like this, I tell people if that activity is coming up any at all, that's great. That's cause for celebration. And the only way I know how to coach people to do that, if I'm rewarding in the 13 to 16 hertz range, that is hopefully this person's low beta range. And low beta goes along with a calm external focus. Even though this is a bipolar protocol, I would still use that coaching strategy to say, see if you can have a calm external focus. And that means, if you notice you've been caught up, really wrapped up in following one thought, for a pretty long time, we just want to drop it and shift your focus out to something you're seeing or hearing in the environment around you, right? And then if they're doing that, hopefully this average amplitude of what we're rewarding is going to increase. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about T4 minus P4.
How many more
This is
minutes do we have?
different than the other protocols we've just been talking about.
Say what?
How many more minutes do we have?
We have, well, some of this is questioned at the end.
I think I picked my limit, Jen. I can't
Okay.
face her anymore, but I want to hear the rest. It's just sometimes she gets on a roll. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And then it's hard to take it all in.
Yeah.
Well, if you here, let me just turn this off for a second.
Because our other protocols were interhemispheric, where one was on one side of the head and the other was on the other side of the head. Well, T4 minus P4, both those sites are on the right side of the head, and they aren't that far away from each other. The closer two sites are, the more we would expect them to be doing similar things. So I don't have exact numbers for what the average amplitude should be at a T4 minus P4 hookup, but I have rough guidelines. Okay, so here again, we do not want one of our inhibit bands being noticeably higher than the other two in amplitude. If it is, that's going to be the target of our training. So in this example, it's the 11.7 is kind of noticeably higher than the other two. So that's going to be the target of my training. That's where I'm going to set my threshold the toughest. I'll make the other two easier. I'm going to put all the emphasis on helping this person shift their focus out. So this is a 10 to 13 hertz reward. Hopefully it's in this person's alpha range. They might have a slightly faster idling speed, but hopefully it's the sweet spot for their brain. And if alpha is the balance point between inner and outer focus, and their average amplitude and their slow wave activity is way higher than their alpha reward activity, then you can still bet they're kind of stuck inside their head a little too much. So instead of being in the balance point between inner and outer focus, they're too much in the inner focus. Okay, so again, you want them working on shifting their focus outward, being here now. With our traumatized people, that's again easier said than done, right? And so, but what we're trying to help them do, and I have direct conversations with my people about this, I just say what we're trying to do is help your nervous system know there are places that are safe enough to let down your guard and to just be present with what's happening right now, because nothing bad is going to happen. I always tell people, nobody in this office is going to do anything on purpose to hurt you. And if they tried, they'd have to come through me. So this is a safe, and I know how to box. So this is a safe place for us to experiment with what it's like to just be where we are right now, instead of thoughts about the past or worries about the future. Let's just see if we can be where we are right now and see how that goes. The other reason why we want to really watch that 2 to 6 hertz activity with a T4 minus P4 hookup, or any bipolar, any slow wave inhibit with any protocol that you're using with a developmental trauma person, you do want to watch the slow wave activity, because that's the range where disassociation and flashback occurs. So we don't want that activity going up too high. And if it is, sometimes you have to stop it and check in with the person, right? Anyway, that was a long-winded explanation there, but in this set of numbers, the slow wave would be the target of my training. This is another T4 minus P4 hookup. And here, both the inhibits are similar. They're higher than our reward, And I know just with our little mantra, high before low, fast before slow, back before front, right? So if we are wanting their alpha amplitude or the difference in their alpha amplitude to come up, one of the first things you have to do if you're interested in your alpha amplitude coming up is bringing down your fast frequency beta activity, especially if your fast frequency beta activity is higher than your alpha activity, because it is your brain cells aren't going to idle very well. They aren't going to take a break and just float in the present moment if your nervous system has the pedal to the metal with its foot on the accelerator, right? So in order for alpha amplitude to come up, if it's low, you first have to bring down that fast frequency beta activity if that's high. So that's why this would be the target of my training here. So I got to set my hurdle somewhat easy, because I want to make sure a beep is readily available as long as they're figuring out how to bring their fast frequency beta down. Later on, as they get better at bringing their fast frequency beta down, I might change the focus of my training to getting that alpha amplitude to come up. But I know they don't really have a hope of getting their alpha amplitude to come up before they get that fast frequency beta down. So again, the focus of this training is going to be letting go, allowing it to happen.
Okay.
And experimenting with not working so hard or holding on to so much tension. Here's another T4 minus P4. And this is another example of someone that has too little difference between T4 and P4. And you will see this a lot, because what this basically means is, when you're looking at the alpha activity at T4 versus P4, there's hardly any difference. And chances are there's hardly any difference because this person isn't making very much alpha to begin with. You should not have really high amounts of alpha amplitude in your temporal lobes, because it doesn't feel good to have a lot of alpha activity at your temporal lobes. So we've talked about this before. We want those temporal lobes working to inhibit limbic activity when we're awake and alert, we're doing a task. So they automatically don't have very much alpha activity. There should be a fair amount of alpha activity showing up at P4, right? And so if we're looking at the difference in the alpha activity at T4 versus P4 and we're getting a really low number, chances are because they don't have very much alpha at P4. And we're going to try to encourage their brain to learn how to make more alpha at P4, P as in Paul, P4 where it belongs. Right? And you can trust that people's brains are inherently motivated to make, given the choice, they're going to want, everybody's brain will prefer to make alpha at P4 versus T4. Okay, so here again, everything probably has room to come up as long as the difference in what we're rewarding is coming up. And eventually, we would hope that the difference in the alpha reward would be greater than the difference in the slow wave. That's going to take a while, and some people might not ever get there. But as long as they're moving closer to that arrangement, then we're going to be checking in with them in between sessions to see if they're noticing any positive changes in their everyday life, right? But here, our primary emphasis is going to be on our reward threshold. And we want them to reach a little bit to increase the difference. So I'm going to set that threshold in microvolts a little bit higher than the average amplitude is currently coming in. And then my other two thresholds will be treated like ceilings in microvolts, so we don't really want that activity to go much above. But they're really easy. They're set really easy, and we just want to see, can this person make more alpha at P4 where it belongs? It's probably pretty obvious by now, but in a way, this therapist screen is letting the person's brain look in the mirror, see how things are going. And if you're not getting a beat, we want to help the person understand what's getting in the way of them practicing whichever EEG yoga posture we're working on. So if we're rewarding in the alpha range, that's more of this nice open focus. If it's the low beta range, that's a calm external focus. If we're working on the left side and we're doing activating, that's going to be a mid beta, a more engaged focus. So if we see the slow wave going up, chances are they might be losing their focus a little bit, either because they're getting sleepy or daydreamy, or they're just replaying something in their head, or they're thinking of they're not really here right now with what they're doing. If the fast frequency beta is going up, they're trying too hard, they're using more energy than is necessary, they're getting tense, or they're feeling frustrated. And so you might not know. Sometimes the average amplitude clues you in, and you can kind of catch them before they realize it, especially with fast frequency beta, right? If that's steadily going up, if it's going up in the double digits, if it's higher than the other amplitudes, then you can bet that's muscle tension. And oftentimes, as the provider, you'll notice that the person's tensing up before they do. That's when you can pause it. You can pause the game, hitting your F5 key on the first rest period or the next rest period, and you can say, let's just see if you can check in with your body and see if you notice any tension anywhere. In this way, that's part of our job. We're trying, as neurofeedback providers, we're trying to help the person connect the dots with what the mirror is showing them about their current experience. Because as we've said before, the way that someone does one thing is how they do all things. So you're going to, as the person is training, they're going to run into the same types of problems that get in their way of being present in their everyday life. If they're trying too hard, they're tensing up, they're getting worried about stuff, they're losing focus, they're daydreaming, they're falling asleep, they're listening to their inner alarm bells, right? Well, it's going to be reflected back. And part of our job is to help them catch themselves and notice what's going on, and also notice when they make a positive shift, right? And call their attention to how that feels, all right? Because here again, we'll get able to tell based on the average amplitudes of these different frequencies. Is someone spending way too much time on the high end of the arousal continuum or the low end of the arousal continuum? But with all the frequency ranges we've talked about so far, we're trying to get more activity in that middle presence range, right? And it'll become pretty evident fairly quickly about what's getting in the way of this person being more present. We definitely do not want someone sitting there while they're training rehearsing the same old unhelpful thoughts that get in their way in their everyday life. And that will certainly happen, especially with our perfectionistic people. They'll be sitting there thinking, oh, I suck, I can't do this right, I'll never be able to do it, it's hopeless, all those kinds of thoughts tend to come out, right? Well, we want them to notice those thoughts and practice letting them go. Or if frustration comes up, we want them to notice that frustration, but practice relating to that frustration differently. Because part of what we're trying to do is get people unstuck, and that means they have to get out of their normal default mode. Because if nothing changes, nothing changes. And even though this isn't 100% technically accurate, you can think of it this way, that if the person's stuck inside their head, if their slow wave amplitude is the highest amplitude, and that's what they've got to work on bringing down, we got to get them out of their default mode. right? And we gotta get them out of that passively replaying stuff in their head. Because if you're in your default mode, you're not open to new information. Yeah. And the other thing that is interesting that I do want to point out is that in our EEG yoga class, we're definitely practicing a different way of being, but the real change occurs in real life when the person's brain has a choice between doing it the way that it's been doing it that hasn't been working out that well, or doing it this new way it's been practicing it with neurofeedback. And when it decides to do it the new way that it's been practicing with neurofeedback, that's when things really change. And that's cool too. I mean, the same is true with talk therapy. If you're just doing talk therapy, real change doesn't really, the person might have a breakthrough in the session, but the real change occurs when they pick a different behavioral response outside of therapy. Okay. And I don't know if we have any Goldberg's fans in here, but I think it's hilarious because I grew up in the 80s and Coach Meller is one of my favorite characters. But just with coaching, I know that this is often it's a difference